first, only the pressure. A suffocating weight wrapped around his body, squeezing, constricting, crushing his ribs until his lungs burned with the primal need for air. Panic surged through him, an instinctive desperation to move, to break free, but his limbs were useless. He was floating, but not in water. It was something thicker, something that filled his mouth and throat, sliding past his tongue in a slow, suffocating crawl. Then, light. A violent rupture tore through the void, and he was wrenched upward, his body convulsing as he was expelled from the suffocating gel. He emerged gasping, retching, collapsing onto an unyielding metal floor. His fingers curled, scraping against the cold surface as his lungs fought to remember how to breathe. A burning fluid spilled from his mouth, thick and translucent, pooling beneath his trembling form. His skin felt raw, too sensitive, as though it had never touched air before. Every nerve screamed in protest. His chest heaved, the sensation of his own existence overwhelming. Then came the voices. Distant at first, distorted as if traveling through water. They spoke in murmurs, sharp tones laced with curiosity and calculation. He forced his eyes open, his vision blurred by the remnants of the gel that clung to his lashes. Shadows moved around him, figures clad in smooth black suits, their faces obscured by reflective visors. One of them stepped closer. A cold, gloved hand gripped his chin, tilting his head upward. A thin beam of light flashed across his pupils. Cognitive function is active. Stabilization appears successful. A second figure knelt beside him, holding a device that emitted a low-frequency hum. Lines of alien symbols flickered across its surface before shifting into something he could understand. Subject 0, vitals stable, reconstruction successful. His mind latched onto the words like a lifeline. Subject 0. The phrase felt foreign, wrong. He struggled to remember his name, but all that came was a splintered void where memory should have been. The panic returned, sharp and sudden. Where? His voice was hoarse, unrecognizable. His throat burned, the syllables raw and unfamiliar. Where am I? None of them answered. He tried to push himself up, but his muscles betrayed him. A sickening sensation bloomed across his back. His skin felt loose, as if it were not entirely his own. Something within him shifted unnaturally. He felt it move. He clenched his teeth, his breathing shallow. Then a voice that was not spoken aloud invaded his thoughts. You are awake. It was layered, deep, almost mechanical. A presence that coiled around his mind, intrusive yet familiar. He flinched, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. Do not resist. He scrambled backward, pressing himself against the freezing floor. His body did not respond the way it should. His joints felt wrong, too loose, too malleable, as if his bones were still deciding what shape to take. The figures did not react to his distress. They moved with eerie precision, their hands skimming across translucent panels that projected shifting displays of incomprehensible data. Machines hummed in response. The room itself pulsed with a rhythmic vibration, like a living organism breathing around him. His own breath hitched as he caught sight of something reflected in one of the polished surfaces. It was him, but it was not. The man staring back at him had his face, but the skin was too smooth, too seamless. His features held an unnatural symmetry, almost perfect yet unsettling in a way he couldn't articulate. His eyes flickered between deep brown and something else, something darker, something void-like, and beneath his flesh, just under the surface, something pulsed and twitched. A sudden sharp pain lanced through his skull. He clutched his head, a wave of fractured memories surging forward, flashes of a past life, a name, his name, on someone's lips, lost beneath the sound of screaming. Fire, pain, the agonizing sensation of his own flesh splitting apart, a moment of finality, death. But he was not dead. He should be dead, his stomach twisted, nausea threatening to overtake him. His hands were shaking. He forced himself to look down at them, only to see something writhing beneath the surface of his palm, shifting like liquid muscle. The skin stretched, rippled as if rearranging itself. A sharp gasp tore from his throat, but before he could react further, the figures around him stepped back. The one closest to him tilted its head slightly, as if observing an experiment reaching its final stage. Then, the same voice returned, sliding into his mind like a parasite. "We have much to discuss. You are not who you think you are." His breath hitched, and deep inside he felt it again. Something inside him waking up. He couldn't sleep. Not that he was sure he even needed sleep anymore. Time had lost its meaning in this place. There were no windows, no way to tell if it was day or night. Just the sterile glow of the overhead lights, the rhythmic hum of unseen machines, and the ever-present sensation of being watched. His body was healing, or rather, it was changing. At first, the pain was subtle, an ache in his joints, a dull pressure beneath his skin. But it grew worse. The more he moved, the more he felt it. His muscles stretched in ways they shouldn't. His bones creaked, not like a body in recovery, but as if they were reforming. The scientists, if they could even be called that, hadn't given him a name. Just Subject Zero, a designation, a label for something that wasn't supposed to exist. They observed him with clinical detachment. They prodded, scanned, measured. They whispered in their strange, sterile language while their machines hummed. Occasionally, one of them would reach out and press against his skin, as if checking for weak points. They never told him why. The only answers came from the voice. Not their voices, but the one inside his head. It spoke in fragmented thoughts, layered and ancient. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it drowned out everything else. It knew things about him that he didn't. You are awake. You are unfinished. Each time he tried to fight against it, pain lanced through his skull, as if his very cells were resisting his own denial. He caught his reflection in the observation room's glass again. He had been avoiding it, but something compelled him to look. His face was mostly unchanged. The same sharp cheekbones, the same deep-set eyes. But now something shifted beneath the surface. The skin rippled unnaturally, like a thin layer stretched too tight over something alive. His lips trembled as he lifted his hand to his face. Number. His fingers had changed too. They were longer, more precise, the nails sharper, almost translucent. His veins pulsed a faint, iridescent color beneath his skin. He pressed a trembling hand to his arm, trying to steady himself. The moment he touched it, it moved. His own flesh twisted beneath his grip, reacting as if something inside it was aware. A strangled cry left his throat as he stumbled backward. His skin rippled again, stretching and shifting before settling back into place. He clutched his forearm, his breath ragged. This wasn't just a body recovering from trauma. This was something else. You were remade. The voice slid through his mind again, calm, unwavering. He clenched his teeth, trying to shove it out. They call it resurrection, but it is not. You are a convergence of species, a living construct of human and something older, and they chose you for a reason. The words lodged deep into his brain, as if they had always been there. His breathing turned shallow. His heart pounded against his ribs. "No," he whispered. "No, He wasn't sure what he was denying anymore. A memory surfaced without warning. A place that wasn't here. A world that wasn't this sterile metal hell. Pain. A bright explosion of agony as his body was torn apart. Flesh seared, bones shattered. The unbearable sensation of being peeled away from himself. He had died. That much was real. He had died, and yet he was still here. His stomach twisted violently. He staggered toward the nearest surface, bracing himself as bile rose in his throat. His insides churned wrong, like they weren't fully settled. He gagged, coughing up something thick, something that gleamed dark against the metal floor. His body was rejecting itself. Or was it adapting? A new wave of pain erupted in his skull, his vision fracturing into static. And then, something inside him moved, not a muscle spasm, not an involuntary twitch. Something separate from him, something living inside him, adjusting itself. A garbled scream ripped from his throat as he collapsed to his knees, his arms convulsed, fingers stretching as if trying to escape their own skin. His bones felt fluid, reforming as if something else was deciding what shape they should take. For a horrifying moment, he felt his ribs bend, his breath hitched, his mind reeled. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. His body snapped back into place, too fast, too seamlessly, like nothing had happened, like it had simply corrected itself. He was shaking. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He could still feel it, the thing that had just adjusted him. His skin was damp with sweat. His breath was ragged. But when he looked down at his arms, his hands, they were normal again. His mind screamed at him to reject this, to rip himself open and claw whatever it was out of him. But then another voice spoke, a real one this time. "You felt it, didn't you?" He jerked his head up. One of the scientists was standing just outside the observation room, watching him through the glass. She was different, not clad in the full suit like the others. Her face was exposed, her features gaunt, hollow. Her eyes, gray like faded metal. She wasn't afraid of him. "You're not sick," she continued, her voice low, deliberate. "You're not broken." She tilted her head slightly. "You're becoming..." A cold wave of realization crashed over him. This wasn't some kind of post-death side effect. This was a process, and it was not finished yet. The ship hurtled through the void, its engines thrumming like a distant heartbeat. He sat in the dimly lit cabin, staring at his own hands, waiting for them to betray him again. The team around him spoke in hushed voices, their discussions laced with unease. They had been chosen, humans and off-worlders alike, tasked with an impossible mission to investigate the first site of infection. He knew better. This wasn't an infection, it wasn't a disease, it was an evolution, and it had already begun inside him. No one else knew. Not yet. He had learned how to hide it, how to suppress the rippling movements beneath his skin, how to control the strange, shifting reflexes that surfaced when he wasn't careful. But the deeper they ventured into the unknown, the harder it became to ignore the changes. The call was getting stronger. The research station loomed ahead, orbiting a desolate moon. Its once pristine structure was marred by darkness, its exterior riddled with fractures and pulsing organic growths that clung like tumors. Lights flickered sporadically, but the station itself was silent. No distress signals, transmissions. It was already too late. They docked. The airlock opened with a reluctant hiss, as if the station itself did not want them to enter. The silence was suffocating. Inside, the walls were not metal anymore. They were something else. The first steps into the corridor sent a wave of nausea through him. The floor was slick, warm, as if it were alive. Faint, pulsing veins ran along the panels, their faint bioluminescent glow casting eerie shadows. A smell hit them, thick, sickly sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. Then came the first sign of what had happened here. Not bodies, pieces. A discarded arm, still wrapped in the torn remains of a uniform, fused into the wall as if it had been absorbed mid-motion. Bones jutted from the structure, stripped of flesh, as if something had peeled them clean. "Jesus," one of the soldiers muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay together," the commander ordered, but their voices felt small here, as if they were intruding on something ancient, something awake. Then the shapes emerged from the shadows. At first, they looked human. Then they moved. Too fast, too wrong. A blur of twisted limbs, bodies that had been reassembled in ways that defied nature. Stretched torsos, bifurcated skulls, teeth where there shouldn't be teeth. And worst of all, they were still alive. Their eyes moved, their mouths opened, but no words came out, only wet, garbled sounds as if they were trying to scream, but no longer knew how. The first shot rang out, then another. The walls screamed back. The station itself reacted, the organic growths convulsing, shuddering like a living body. The floor warped beneath their feet, and suddenly the station was no longer just a place. It was a host, a warning, a graveyard still in the process of digesting its dead. The team scattered. The shooting did nothing. Bullets tore through the shifting masses of flesh and bone, but they did not stop. They adapted. One of the soldiers, Cooper, was yanked into the darkness, his scream cut short with a sickening crunch. Another, Rao, tried to run, but her legs twisted the wrong way mid-stride, her body snapping apart like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Something grabbed him. Cold, wet fingers wrapped around his wrist, a human hand, or what was left of one. The thing that had once been a scientist stared at him with wide, milk-white eyes, its mouth stretching open, far too wide, jaw unhinging like a snake, revealing rows of malformed teeth growing in spirals down its throat. A whisper slipped from its lips. Not words, something closer to recognition. He felt it, a connection, A pull. The creature tilted its head. Its flesh rippled the same way his own had. And then it stopped. It didn't attack. It saw something in him, something familiar. Then the others stopped too. The horrors that had torn his team apart hesitated, shifting, twitching, their twisted forms almost questioning. And in that moment he knew. He understood why he had been chosen. He was not here to stop it. He was here to lead it. The station pulsed again. Something deeper inside it was awake now. It was waiting. And so was he. There was no more running. The station was alive. It breathed beneath his feet, the walls shifting like muscle, corridors flexing like the throat of something massive. The air was thick, pulsing with the rhythmic contractions of a body that recognized him. His team was gone. Cooper, Rao, everyone, swallowed, absorbed, rewritten. The remnants of their bodies were stitched into the walls, their faces half-formed, their hands reaching out from the pulsing mass, frozen in an eternal moment of horror. They weren't dead, not completely. Some of them were still moving, their flesh bending, reforming, struggling to become something new. But they weren't the ones screaming anymore. The horror had become something deeper, something colder. Because now he could hear it. Not just the voice in his head, but the station itself. The whispers under the surface of his skin. The slow realization that the dividing line between himself and it was dissolving. He felt the walls moving before they moved. He knew where the others were before they even turned the corner. Because he was no longer separate from it. He was becoming a part of it. His hands trembled as he raised them in front of his face. His skin rippled, adjusting itself to the temperature, stretching like something elastic. The bones inside his fingers weren't entirely solid anymore. He flexed them, and the joints rearranged themselves before settling back into place. He wasn't just healing, he was adapting. A violent shudder racked his body as another wave of change tore through him. His spine lengthened, a sickening series of cracks echoing through the silent corridors as vertebrae twisted and reset. His breathing hitched, his lungs expanded, inhaling deeper, as if they were adjusting for something bigger than human oxygen. And the voice inside him, the one that had whispered ever since he woke up in that sterile chamber, finally spoke clearly. You understand now. His heart pounded against his ribs, but even that was changing. The rhythm of it was slowing, deepening, not in exhaustion, but in alignment. His pulse synchronized with the station, with the walls, with the pulsing growths that had once been people. He stumbled forward, hands gripping the walls for balance. They accepted him, his fingers sinking in slightly before the surface tightened around his touch. Not as an attack, but as if it were welcoming him back. A shuddering breath escaped his lips. This was never a mission. This was never a battle to stop something. He had been sent here to complete it. And deep inside, he had always known. He turned a corner, and there it was, the heart of the station. It was not a machine. It was not an engine. It was a womb. A massive, pulsating chamber of raw, shifting flesh. It hung suspended in the air, writhing, breathing, birthing. Translucent sacks of organic matter lined the walls, stretching, shifting, their contents twisting inside. Some of them were human-shaped, others were not. Some were becoming something new, just like he was. The moment he stepped inside, he felt it fully. the connection snapping into place, the awareness of something bigger than himself, bigger than Earth, bigger than the entire idea of humanity. They had never been alone. The plan had always been in motion. Earth was not conquering space. It was being prepared for integration, and he was the first. His body relaxed, no longer resisting. He let the process take hold, let the final pieces settle. His skin stretched, his bones adjusted, his senses expanded. He was not losing himself. He was finding what he had always been meant to be. The figures in the sacks turned toward him, their movements slow, liquid, recognizing him, welcoming him. The walls sighed, the station shifting, aligning, accepting. And for the first time, he did not fight it. He took a step forward, and the station breathed him in. Final transmission from Research Station. Theta 9. The first phase is complete. Earth will be next. The research station stood like a parasite upon the dead Colossus, a cluster of steel and glass perched atop the rotting behemoth's ribs. It was hastily constructed, its walls already rusting under the relentless winds that swept across the barren expanse. Here, in this remote sector, there was no interference from the outside world, only the silence of death and the cold gaze of the towering corpse. Dr. Victor Rice pressed a gloved hand against the petrified flesh beneath his feet. The texture was wrong, too solid, too smooth, like something that had turned to stone, yet retained the grotesque elasticity of something still alive. The Titan had fallen months ago, yet no scavengers came to claim its remains. Even bacteria seemed unwilling to partake in its decay. The body stretched for miles, an impossible monument of twisted bone and sinew, half buried in the dust. Its skull, cracked open like a ruptured shell, revealed no brain, just an empty cavity where something else should have been. The government had wasted no time in cordoning off the area, citing national security concerns. Only a handful of scientists were granted access to study it, each sworn to silence. As Victor moved toward the excavation site, he could hear the mechanical whine of drills echoing through the air. The team had been working tirelessly to penetrate the Titan's chest cavity, driven by the unshakable feeling that something was inside. They had been right. Dr. Rice called a voice through the comms. "We've breached the cavity." Victor's pulse quickened. He descended the scaffolding, his boots echoing against the metal grating. The moment he stepped into the excavation site, the scent hit him, a wet, organic odor, like meat left to rot in a sealed room. The opening was irregular, jagged where the drills had cut through the hardened flesh. What lay beyond was unnatural. A chamber hollowed out within the Titan's ribcage, lined with something that pulsed. Victor stepped closer, scanning the walls. They weren't flesh. They weren't bone. They were something in between, glistening under the dim, artificial light. The interior was vast, far too large to belong to any standard biological structure. It was less of an organ and more of a containment unit. And something lay curled at the center. At first, Victor thought it was a fetus, a smaller creature nestled within the Titan's remains. But as the team illuminated the space, the details became clearer. The thing was too long, too thin. Its limbs were folded at unnatural angles, its skin translucent, stretched taut over an intricate network of veins that pulsed with a sickly green glow. It was wrapped in a sinewy membrane, partially fused to the walls around it. Like a parasite sealed inside its dying host. For a long moment, the scientists stood in silence. The air was thick with the sound of breathing, of disbelief, and then the thing twitched. Victor took an involuntary step back. A ripple moved through the membranous cocoon. Something slid beneath the creature's skin, a shifting mass that moved against the fragile casing of its form. The radio crackled. "Doctor, what the hell is that?" Victor's lips were dry. He could feel something pressing against his skull. Not a voice, not words, but a presence. It was aware of them. The thing inside the Titan's corpse opened its eyes, two glossy black orbs, devoid of pupils, locked onto Victor's face. He felt a sharp electric pressure at the base of his skull, a splitting sensation like something was digging through his thoughts. A noise filled the chamber. Not a sound, but a sensation. A flood of images, flashes of something vast, something writhing in liquid, its form shifting and reforming like a nightmare in motion. A planet shrouded in darkness, orbiting a dying sun. A process, something being made, built, designed. The Titans were not creatures. They were products. Victor staggered back, gasping for air. His ears rang. The thing inside the Titan wasn't just alive. It was remembering. The moment passed. The pressure in his skull lessened. The alien blinked once, its black eyes gleaming in the dim light. It had spoken. Not in words, but in knowledge, and Victor understood. This discovery was not meant to be made. Something inside the Titan had been left behind, forgotten, sealed away, and now they had set it free. The research station was silent. It had been hours since they extracted the creature from the Titan's corpse, and yet the unease in the air had only grown. The alien specimen, Theta, as the government designated it, was confined within the containment chamber, surrounded by reinforced glass and monitored by half a dozen biosensors. It had not moved since they placed it inside. Victor Rice stood just beyond the chamber, hands clenched behind his back. The creature was curled in the center, its elongated limbs folded against its body, its skin shifting slightly, almost as if something beneath it was in constant motion. Its black, glossy eyes reflected the dim overhead lights, unblinking, eerily aware. It hasn't eaten. It hasn't tried to escape, Dr. Alara Quinn murmured beside him. It's just waiting. Victor didn't respond. The longer he stared, the more he felt it. The pressure behind his eyes, the creeping sensation at the base of his skull. He had been experiencing it since they first encountered the thing inside the Titan's chest. It wasn't communicating in a way they understood. It was simply showing them. The visions came at night, the images blurred together, of something vast, of great structures pulsing with life, of twisted forms growing in endless vats of flesh. The Titans had been engineered, constructed with careful precision, not by it, but by something else. He had seen them forming, their skins stretched over writhing frames, crafted for a singular purpose. But something had gone wrong. The process had been interrupted. Victor exhaled and turned toward the monitors. The medical scans showed a change in Specimen Theta's cellular structure. The alien was undergoing rapid molecular shifts, its skin darkening in patches, its form adjusting. It's not in stasis, Alara said, studying the readings. It's adapting. Victor tensed. To what? She hesitated. To us. The word sent a shudder down his spine. The lights above flickered. A sharp, high-pitched screech filled the lab, distorting through the speakers. Every monitor spiked, erratic fluctuations, unreadable data flooding the system. Then the glass cracked. The containment unit trembled as a thin fracture spread across its surface, webbing outward. Inside, Specimen Theta remained perfectly still, its black eyes locked on Victor. A sharp pain stabbed into his mind. He gritted his teeth, vision blurring as the pressure inside his skull became unbearable. The images returned, faster this time, the Titans moving, their grotesque forms shifting as they devoured, absorbed, expanded. Then an overwhelming feeling of hunger. He staggered backward, his breath ragged. The pain in his skull lessened, and the static on the monitors abruptly ceased. The glass stopped cracking. The light steadied. Everything returned to silence. Elara was staring at him, her face pale. "Victor, what the hell just happened?" He swallowed, pulse hammering in his throat. "It's awake." They watched for hours after, but Specimen Theta never moved again. It remained curled, silent, watching, waiting. By the time Victor left the lab, the unease in his chest had turned into something heavier. Dread. And he was right to feel it, because by morning it would be gone. The alarms wailed through the research station. Dr. Victor Rice bolted through the dimly lit corridors, his breath sharp and uneven. The air smelled wrong, thick with the metallic tang of blood and something else, something rancid and organic, like flesh left to boil from the inside. Specimen Theta was gone. It had escaped the containment unit sometime during the night. The security footage showed only static where the cameras should have recorded its movement. The glass of its chamber had been found intact. No fractures, no signs of forced exit. It was as if it had simply ceased to exist inside the unit and reappeared elsewhere. But Victor knew better. It had never left at all. He turned a corner and nearly tripped over something wet. His heart slammed against his ribs as his eyes fell upon the body. Dr. Yuri Vaslov, or what was left of him. His corpse was slumped against the wall, his chest cavity peeled open, ribcage splayed like grotesque insect legs. His organs were still inside, but they were pulsing, shifting, moving. Thick strands of sinew stretched outward from his exposed torso, twitching with unnatural life. The worst part was his eyes. They were still open, still aware. Yuri was not dead. Victor staggered backward, bile rising in his throat. The body was changing before his eyes, the skin bubbling, distorting, as if something beneath it was forcing itself to the surface. A sharp gasp from behind him. Dr. Elara Quinn. She had followed the alarms and now stood frozen, staring at Yuri's twisted form. "Oh God," she whispered. "What is it doing to him?" Victor couldn't answer. A wet, choking sound gurgled from Yuri's throat. Elara screamed as the corpse, no, the thing that had once been Yuri, moved. The strands of flesh anchoring his body to the wall tightened, pulling him upright. His fingers twitched, curling in sharp, erratic movements. His lips parted, but the voice that came out was not his own. It was layered, distorted. Not one voice, but many. "It's not enough," it rasped. "Not enough. More. More." The bones in his jaw cracked, unhinging like a snake's maw. Something inside pushed forward, something that had not been there before. Victor grabbed Ilara's wrist and ran. They didn't stop until they reached the central lab, slamming the door behind them and locking it. Victor's chest heaved, his mind racing. Yuri wasn't infected. He was being rebuilt. Ilara pressed a hand over her mouth, her whole body trembling. It's rewriting him. Victor swallowed hard. The alien, Specimen Theta, it's not just adapting. It's assimilating. The radio on the desk crackled. A voice, Yuri's voice, but not his. You should not have found me. The signal cut out. The overhead lights flickered. A dull, wet sound echoed from somewhere beyond the door. More of them were changing. Victor's stomach turned. The Titans had never been the true threat. They were just the beginning. The real invasion was happening inside them now. The facility was dead. Dr. Victor Rice stood in the main control room, his hands trembling as he tightened his grip on the radio. The walls around him were slick with a wet, fleshy residue. The steel framework of the station warped and pulsing as if it had grown veins. The air was thick with the stench of rot, of something far worse than death, a body in transition. The others were gone. Ilara had been the last. He had seen it happen, seen her body betray her, her skin tightening, shifting as something beneath the surface, something no longer human, forced itself into being. She had clutched at her throat, choking on her own breath, her fingers splitting open as new, thicker limbs began to push through. She had whispered his name before she collapsed. Now she was one of them. Victor pressed his back against the cold metal of the console, his breath sharp and shallow. The radio crackled in his grip, his only connection to the outside world. But he already knew the truth. No one was coming. The government had sealed the facility. The emergency lockdown had not been an accident. They had known. The moment Specimen Theta had gone missing, the higher-ups had stopped responding to transmissions. No extraction, no rescue, only containment. This was never about studying the Titans. It was about keeping what was inside them from getting out. And now it was too late. A sound rippled through the corridor outside, wet, shifting, not footsteps, something crawling. Victor forced himself to move. He powered up the main console, fingers shaking as he activated the distress beacon. A weak red light blinked in response. The automated signal flared to life, broadcasting on all available frequencies. A last, desperate message. His voice cracked as he spoke. "This is Dr. Victor Rice. If anyone is receiving this..." He swallowed, forcing the words through his dry throat. "The station is compromised. It is not a disease. It is not a parasite. It is something else. Something older than us. Older than the Titans. And it's still changing." A sound behind him. Soft, deliberate. He turned, heart hammering. The doorway was open. And it was there. Not Specimen Theta. Not anymore. The shape it had taken was too fluid, too wrong. Its limbs extending, retracting, a shifting mess of bone and sinew, merging and unraveling in slow, deliberate waves. It had a face now. His face. Victor's breath hitched. He staggered back as the creature took another step, its form flickering between something inhuman and something almost recognizable. "You understand now." The words were not spoken aloud. They bloomed inside his head, unbidden, a whisper behind his skull, a voice stolen from 100 throats. His fingers tightened around the radio. The creature tilted its head, its mouth stretched into a smile that was not a smile at all. "You are ready." A sharp snap, the lights above shattered in unison. Darkness swallowed the room. The radio slipped from Victor's grasp. For a moment, all that remained was the flickering red light of the distress beacon, blinking in the silence. Then, slowly, the walls began to breathe, and the last transmission cut to static. The first sensation was cold, a deep, bone-chilling cold that clung to the skin like frostbite. The second was silence, heavy, suffocating, absolute. One by one they awoke. Metal grated against metal as a prisoner stirred, his breath fogging in the dim light. His muscles ached, stiff from an unnatural sleep. Around him, others were beginning to rise, disoriented and sluggish. The air was thick with an acrid, metallic scent. It clung to the back of their throats, making each breath feel tainted. The chamber they were in was vast yet claustrophobic, its walls lined with panels of decayed machinery and flickering consoles. Dim red lights pulsed overhead, casting grotesque shadows across the floor. The only exit was a single door, smooth, seamless metal with no handle or visible mechanism to open it. The prisoners exchanged wary glances. Some were dressed in standard-issue prison jumpsuits, others in rags stained with sweat and time. No one spoke at first. Their memories were fragmented, slipping through their minds like water through broken fingers. They knew who they were, knew what they had done, but how they had come to be here was a void, an emptiness that pressed in from all sides. Then the screens flickered to life. A burst of static, a distorted hum. The nearest console flared, and a distorted figure appeared on the monitors. Its features were obscured behind a mask-like apparatus, a tangle of tubes and mechanical breathers that hissed softly with each exhalation. The eyes, black, reflective slits, regarded them with something close to amusement. "Welcome, inmates," the voice rasped. It was neither human nor entirely artificial, the sound carrying a wet, mechanical resonance. The words crawled through the room like an infection, seeping into their minds. "You have been selected for the judgment trials. Your crimes condemned you to rot in the void of Earth's prisons, but we have given you a chance. Here, in the Dark Zone, you will prove your worth. Survive, and you may earn your absolution. Fail, and your existence will be erased." Someone cursed under their breath. Another prisoner, a lean man with a shaved head, took a step forward. His voice was hoarse from disuse. "What the hell is this? Where are we?" A long pause. The screen flickered, distorting the figure's face before stabilizing again. "You are beyond the reach of Earth. That is all you need to know." The room seemed to shrink. The words settled in like a sickness. "Your survival will be tested. Your sins will be judged. There is no escape, only passage or oblivion." A mechanical hiss sounded from the walls. The prisoners flinched, instinctively backing away as the air pressure shifted. The door that had been sealed moments ago let out a groan, metal grinding against metal, and slid open. Beyond it, a corridor stretched forward, dark, endless, humming with unseen energy. And then the voice spoke again. softer this time. "Begin." A deep, resonant clunk echoed through the chamber as the lights overhead flickered, dimming further. A cold draft leaked in from the corridor, carrying with it the scent of something wet, something organic. The prisoners hesitated, but the chamber behind them remained sealed, the screens now black. There was no choice. One by one, they stepped forward into the dark. The corridor was suffocating, the walls slick with condensation, the air thick with an underlying scent of rot. The lights above flickered in irregular intervals, casting fractured shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally along the metal flooring. No one spoke as they advanced, each footstep swallowed by the oppressive silence. The door at the end of the passage was unlike the others, wide, curved, embedded with veins of dark, organic matter that pulsed faintly, as though alive. The moment the last prisoner stepped through, the door slammed shut behind them with a wet, bone-jarring finality. The room before them was massive, its ceiling stretching beyond the reach of the dim lights above. Glass chambers lined the walls, filled with a viscous yellowed liquid that distorted the forms floating within. Limbs, torsos, organs suspended in unnatural stillness, their flesh preserved yet disturbingly active, twitching, pulsating, as though aware of their presence. At the center of the chamber stood a surgical table, its surface rusted and streaked with something dark. Strapped to it was something that had once been human, its body flayed open, ribs pried apart to expose a chest cavity teeming with movement. But the worst was its face, recognizable yet wrong. Marco recoiled violently, his breath catching in his throat. No, that's impossible. The thing strapped to the table was him, or rather something wearing the ruined husk of what he used to be. The body's lips curled back in something that might have been a grin, revealing teeth that were too long, too jagged. Its eyes were open and watching him. The monitors flared to life, the distorted voice returning. "Confess, or be consumed." Marco shook his head violently. "I don't understand." "You will." The room trembled. The glass chambers along the walls cracked and burst, spilling their grotesque contents onto the floor. The discarded flesh twitched, limbs dragging themselves toward the center of the room with grotesque, jerking movements. Then, the walls began to move. What had appeared to be panels of metal were instead something far worse. Sheets of stitched flesh, human skin stretched taut over bone-like structures. Faces emerged from the shifting mass, their mouths open in soundless screams. Some were rotten, others fresh, their eyes rolling wildly. Marco stumbled back, his breath ragged. His crimes, the ones he had spent years justifying, denying, were crawling toward him, reaching with trembling finger-like appendages made from the very organs he had stolen. He turned to run, but the door was gone, replaced by a pulsing, membranous wall. The other prisoners scattered, their minds buckling under the impossible reality before them. One man, desperate, grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the floor and slashed at the shifting flesh. A severed hand twitched and reattached itself, the wound closing almost instantly. Then the walls lunged. A prisoner screamed as veins shot from the ceiling, wrapping around his limbs, yanking him off his feet. His skin bubbled and split, something crawling beneath the surface. He convulsed violently as his spine bent backwards at an impossible angle, his torso splitting open like an overripe fruit. Marco scrambled toward the center of the room, his eyes darting to the monitors. "What do you want? What do I have to do?" The voice returned, a whisper beneath the wet sound of shifting flesh. "Confess," he hesitated. The thing wearing his face let out a gurgling laugh. Its abdomen peeled open, revealing not organs, but a writhing pit of grasping, hungry mouths. Teeth churned in the darkness, slick with blood and bile. Marco choked on his breath. The truth clawed its way up his throat like bile. I sold them," he gasped. "The organs. I took them from people who were still alive. I let them die so I could profit." The room shuddered. The walls convulsed, the limbs recoiling. The faces withered, their mouths snapping shut. Marco collapsed to his knees, his body searing with unbearable heat. Something shifted inside him, pressing against his ribs, crawling through his veins. He screamed as deep, jagged scars carved themselves into his flesh, as though unseen hands were stitching something into place beneath his skin. The other prisoners, those who still stood, began to confess one by one. Each admission tore at their bodies, reshaping them in ways they could not yet understand. But the flesh listened, and it relented. Only one man refused. The walls came for him, enveloping him in a sea of twitching flesh. His screams lasted far too long. Then the door reappeared. The remaining prisoners stumbled forward, shaking, sweating, their bodies altered in ways they could not yet comprehend. The scars they bore were not just wounds. They pulsed, as though something inside them was still awake. The corridor ahead was darker than before, and the next trial was waiting. The corridor stretched endlessly, the dim lights overhead flickering with a sickly yellow hue. The prisoners moved in silence, their bodies battered, their minds fraying at the edges of sanity. The scars from the first trial still burned beneath their skin, twitching with an unnatural sensation, as if something had been sewn into them, something that wasn't entirely theirs. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a deep organic rot, like meat left too long in the heat. It clung to their throats, soured their stomachs. Then they reached the next door. It was different from the last, massive, rounded, its metal surface corroded and pocked with dark, gaping holes. The moment they stepped forward, the door split open like a mouth, the edges lined with fibrous tendrils that twitched as they passed through. Inside, the room was cavernous, shelves of rotting supplies stretched upward, stacked with mold-covered food, decayed meat, and liquefied vegetables oozing through broken containers. The walls dripped with condensation, the floor slick with a rancid, bile-like substance. Something had nested here, something large. A metallic voice crackled to life from unseen speakers. You consumed while others starved. You feasted while others withered. Now you will understand the price of hunger. Samantha, the former executive, exhaled sharply. Her face was pale, her fingers curling into fists. Then the chittering started. It came from everywhere at once, a dry, rustling whisper, like the sound of 1,000 skittering legs against metal. The prisoners backed toward the door, but it was gone, sealed. Something shifted in the shadows above. A bulk of shimmering, blackened flesh unfurled, its surface glistening with mucus. It clung to the ceiling with limb-like appendages, its form twisting, stretching, a grotesque fusion of chitin and exposed muscle. Then the eggs burst. Along the floor, scattered between the rotted supplies, the bulbous, pulsating sacs trembled violently before splitting open with a wet rupture. From within, the creatures poured out. They were spindly, emaciated, their bodies thin and elongated, like starved husks of human figures, their skin stretched too tightly over jagged bone. Their mouths yawned open, revealing rows upon rows of writhing, blackened teeth, and their fingers, long, needle-thin, twitched hungrily. Samantha screamed. Her body convulsed, her stomach bulging unnaturally beneath her jumpsuit. Something was moving inside her, something chewing its way free. She collapsed onto her hands and knees, retching black bile onto the floor. Her veins bulged, her skin splitting at the seams. Then, a wet tear. Her abdomen burst open, and something slick and writhing slithered out. The creature that emerged was glossy, glistening, its form still coated in viscera. It twitched, unfurling its insectile limbs, its eyeless head turning toward the others. Samantha let out a ragged, half-human moan, her body still jerking as if she were alive, but her insides were hollow, emptied, consumed. The parasites lunged, chaos erupted. A prisoner ran, slipping on the blood-slicked floor, but one of the creatures was on him instantly. It latched onto his chest, its fingers puncturing his skin, and its jaw unhinged, revealing a second inner mouth that clamped down on his throat. His scream was cut short as his body caved inward, his flesh folding like brittle paper. The remaining survivors bolted through the maze of rotting shelves, their breath ragged, their hearts hammering. The creatures chased them in frantic, jerking movements, their starved frames propelled by unnatural speed. Another prisoner was dragged down, his leg snapped backward as a clawed hand seized his ankle. He thrashed violently, but they descended on him in seconds, their teeth sinking into his flesh, peeling it away in long, wet strands. They didn't just eat him. They hollowed him out. Only 3 remained. Derek spotted a maintenance hatch near the far end of the room, half buried beneath toppled crates. "There!" he shouted. They sprinted, lungs burning. The creatures skittered after them, their elongated arms grasping, twitching, their mouths leaking strings of thick, black saliva. Reaching the hatch, Derek wrenched it open, shoving the others through. One of the creatures lunged, its fingers raking across his side, tearing fabric and skin. He gasped in pain, barely making it inside before slamming the hatch shut. A heavy, wet thud sounded from the other side as something collided with the metal. Claws scraped violently, but the creatures did not follow. Breathing heavily, Derek looked down. His side was bleeding, the flesh torn open, but it wasn't just blood leaking out. Something inside him was moving. The corridor ahead stretched forward, and the next trial was waiting. The corridor had changed. The metal walls, once solid, now pulsed, their surfaces slick with something organic, wet, alive. The air was thick, heavy, filled with a scent both metallic and sweetly rancid, like meat left to fester in damp heat. The 3 remaining prisoners, Derek, Nadia, and Owen, moved forward, their footsteps sluggish, weighed down by exhaustion and and something else. Derek's wound had worsened. Beneath the torn fabric of his jumpsuit, the gash along his ribs pulsed, something beneath the surface twitching, shifting, growing. He had stopped looking at it, stopped thinking about it, because the alternative was accepting what it meant. The corridor ended at a door unlike any they had seen before. It was seamless, silver, its surface polished like glass, reflecting their twisted, gaunt faces. The skin beneath their eyes was dark, sunken. Their bodies were leaner, their bones pressing against skin, yet their scars bulged as if something beneath them had taken root. Then the door opened on its own. The chamber inside was empty. No rotting walls, no shifting flesh, no horrors waiting in the shadows. Just a single, sterile room, and in the center, a mirror. The moment they stepped inside, the door sealed behind them, the hiss of pressurized air whispering like a final breath. The walls, smooth and seamless, held no sign of exit. There was only the mirror, tall, stretching across the far wall, reflecting them in crisp, unnatural clarity. Then the voice returned. "You have survived." The words slithered through the room, colder than before, no longer mocking, no longer mechanical. There was something deeply human in the way it spoke now, something that sent a deep, primal fear curling in Derek's gut. "The final judgment is upon you." Nadia exhaled, ragged. "What now?" No answer. Instead, the mirror changed. The reflection blurred, then shifted, warping, bending, reshaping into something that wasn't them. Derek's breath caught. The people in the mirror looked like them, but they were not them. Their bodies were wrong, stretched, their limbs elongated, sharpened. Their flesh pulsed, skin peeling back in places to reveal something beneath. Slick, segmented, chitinous. Their faces were grotesquely hollowed, their mouths too wide, their eyes, God, their eyes, black, empty, hunger without end. You were never meant to leave. The room trembled. Derek staggered back, pressing a hand to his chest, his skin shifting beneath his palm. A deep, gut-wrenching pain crawled up his spine, something splitting inside him, something awakening. Owen screamed, doubling over, clutching his stomach. His fingers dug into his flesh, nails peeling away skin, revealing something black and glistening underneath. "No," Nadia whispered, shaking her head, stepping back, her entire body trembling. "Your bodies are no longer your own." Derek felt it then. The truth. The trials had never been about judgment, never about punishment. They had been preparation. His knees buckled as his spine cracked, his ribcage widening, stretching, his flesh splitting like overripe fruit. He could feel it inside him, growing, changing, becoming. Owen let out a guttural, inhuman shriek as his jaw unhinged, his skin caving inward, his arms splintering into something else. Tendons pulling, bones reshaping into jagged, twisted appendages. His scream became a gurgling choke as his throat collapsed, his body folding inward, his human form peeling away like a useless shell. Nadia pressed herself against the wall, shaking. "No, no, no!" The mirror rippled, and then they stepped through. The things that had once been them. Silent, taller, hollowed. They stood where their reflections had been, gazing upon their dying human shells with cold, unreadable stares. Derek tried to scream, but all that came out was a wet, gurgling sound, his throat too warped, too stretched to form words, his skin peeled away in ribbons, his muscles rearranging, his bones bending to something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. You are the next, the continuation. Nadia turned just as the first of them moved toward her. Their elongated fingers reached for her face, their touch searing, reshaping, unmaking. She opened her mouth to scream, but it was already too late. The chamber was silent once more. The room reset. The mirror cleared. The bodies, now empty husks, lay scattered on the cold floor. And then the door slid open again. Outside, in the long, dark corridor, the cycle began anew. Somewhere far away, in the infinite void beyond the station, a new batch of prisoners awoke in cold silence, their breath fogging the air. Their trials had yet to begin, and deep within the walls of the dark zone, something stirred, watching, waiting. The cycle would never end.